This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searles, and this week, Simon Phipps and I will be talking to Vinay Gupta about the future of stuff. That's coming up next. Floss Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Securing every access point in your company doesn't have to be a challenge. LastPass unifies access and authentication to make securing your employees simple and secure, even when they are working remotely. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 606, recorded Wednesday, November 25th, 2020. The future of stuff. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Like expired milk, 30% of your customers' data goes bad every year. That's money down the drain. Visit Melissa's developer portal for free access to data quality APIs, demos, and code samples. Freshen up your sour data today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. And by Linode. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines and develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Get $100 in free credit when you create your account today at linode.com/floss or text TWIT to 474747 for a direct link to the offer. Good morning, day or evening, everybody. I'm Doc Searles. This is Floss Weekly. Welcome to this and to my co-host, Simon Phipps, who will now tell us where he is.
Well, I think
there he is.
I'm still in Southampton, Doc, but I haven't actually been out of the house for about 2 weeks. So it's possible that I'm not in Southampton anymore and the house has moved, but I think I am.
If you order food, do you get the flat kind they can slide under the door? That used to be geek food. You get popcorn and stuff like that.
So I actually do quite a lot of cooking here. I made a particularly good pork and bean casserole yesterday, which is what we've been having. We haven't actually had any delivery here for, I don't know. It's possible society has collapsed outside and we just haven't noticed. I don't know.
As long as it doesn't collapse inside your house, you should be in good. You should be in good shape. I'm in Santa Barbara, where, for somebody who has literally millions of flying miles with airlines, and who all but lived in the UK for a while, just because I visited so much, and got to know our guests this way. It's a tough one. But I'm reconciled to kind of being here most of the time. So our guest is Vinay Gupta. Are you familiar with Vinay?
So I've never met Vinay. No, this is a new experience for me, meeting Vinay for the first time virtually.
That's wonderful. Well, I think we'll have a good show, and we should we'll get into it right after I tell you that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Ever forgotten to check the date on a carton of milk? Like milk, your customer data goes bad. In fact, up to 30% of customer data goes bad each year. Melissa makes sure your data is accurate and current so you reach the right customers. Their tools have helped businesses maintain fresh data for over 35 years. Don't throw money down the drain with bad data. Verify addresses, emails, phone numbers, and names in real time with Melissa. Melissa's global address verification service verifies addresses for 240 plus countries and territories at the point of entry. This ensures that only valid billing and shipping addresses are captured and used in your systems. Identify your customers and get to know them. Add customer demographic information to your records, such as property and mortgage data, even marital status, and social media handles. Melissa's flexible deployment options offer different platforms to suit any preference, business size, or budget. With flexible on-premise web service, secure FTP processing, and software as a service, that's SaaS, delivery options, you can choose the best way to meet your unique business needs. Melissa continuously undergoes independent security audits to reinforce their commitment to data security, privacy, and compliance requirements. They have the utmost dedication to your data's security by implementing strong controls and safeguards in processing your data. That includes SOC2, HIPAA, and GDPR compliant. Over 10,000 businesses trust the address experts. And with the holiday season right around the corner, it's time to take control of your customer data. Trust Melissa to be your foundation for data-driven success. Melissa is supporting communities and qualifying essential workers during COVID-19. See if your organization qualifies for 6 months of free service by applying online. Don't put up with sour customer contact data. Try Melissa's APIs in the developer portal. It's easy to log on, sign up, and start playing in the API sandbox 24/7. Get started today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/twit. So our guest today is Vinay Gupta. Vinay is an old friend, at least in internet years. As I said earlier, visited often when we've been in the UK. He's the founder of Mattereum, a London-based fintech company using legally enforceable smart contracts to enable sale, lease, and transfer of physical property and other legal rights. He calls himself Scottish working class, albeit a Hindu hybrid with small, strong monastic tendencies. That's one line from his book, The Future of Stuff, which is also the title of our show. He's also known for his work on the Hexayurt, which is a public domain disaster relief shelter designed to be built from commonly available materials. And with Ethereum, the distributed network designed to handle smart contracts. And he's been very involved in Ethereum. He's one of the major figures in the Ethereum world. So welcome, Vinay. I take it you're still in London, I hope, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
Haven't been outside in a while. I'm in a kind of medium high risk group for COVID, and nothing would be more kind of ironic than somebody that used to be a pandemic specialist winding up dying of a pandemic. So I'm kind of hyper cautious. It's a bad scene.
Yeah, I suppose I'm high risk just by being in my demographic, but it's scary stuff. So and I know the pandemic and all that is one of the things that you've paid especially close attention to, but I'd like to start on a topic that's in your book, where you say that the world we live in now is one that was shaped to a large degree by somebody that Simon also knows very well, as do I, which is Richard Stallman. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why you say that, where that comes from, and what it means for the world today. And then maybe Simon can follow up on that.
So, I mean, basically everything which has happened in terms of the trajectory of the internet is built on the ideas from the Free Software Foundation. So Stallman's idea that users have inherent rights and that those rights can be legally protected using licenses, that concept and the enormous body of software that's been created that way is modernity. Right? It's 70% of all phones. It's inside of every non-Windows laptop which is sold. So all of the Macintoshes, all of that stuff, it's all running free software or open source software. And that's also Wikipedia. Wikipedia is under exactly the same licensing models. So if you think of like this enormous explosion that we've had that we think of as being the internet or mobile or just however you want to think about this thing that we're going through right now, all of that stuff is bedrocked on free software. And if the software hadn't been free, if the only available operating systems had been commercial, vendor lock-in and huge problems building complex systems and the problems in cooperation and collaboration that come with that kind of naive commercialism, that would have crippled the growth of this entire internet ecosystem in ways that we can't even imagine. I mean, it would just have been disastrous. And And I think that it's extremely important that we recognize Stallman's work, because there isn't another one of those. Stallman is one of these, once in a century characters. And I think it's important that we kind of lock Stallman's place into history right now, because Stallman is old and his ideas are being diluted by generational change as people just take it for granted that the world works that way. But there was an era before Stallman where nobody really understood that users had rights, and that those rights were critical to the, kind of development of these whole ecologies or ecosystems of knowledge.
So I'm less sure about that. I think that I've looked quite a lot at the history of where open source software came from, and I completely agree that Stallman is fundamental in establishing the idea of user rights. I think that's correct. I think that the explosion we've seen in open source software has got multiple roots that are as important. I think that the work that Bill Joy did at the same time that Stallman was on the East Coast, Joy was over on the West Coast working at Berkeley, and his attitude towards his creations and the license that was created around it was profoundly influential in creating Silicon Valley. And neither Silicon Valley nor the free software movement really took off as a cultural phenomenon until the user freedom that Stallman had advocated for on the one hand, and the huge raft of technology availability that came out of Silicon Valley on the other hand, were both available on the internet. So I'm cautious about solely crediting Richard with it, which I think is very important to credit Richard with that focus on user freedom. But I think the modern phenomenon is the compound of that and also some other phenomenon combining together to make the modern reality. Do you agree with that, Vinay, or would you argue?
So I don't think it's that Stallman was the only guy that did this. But I think Stallman is the one who is in greatest danger of being forgotten, right? So, the thing about this is that, I'm trying to find a good way of putting this. So the reality of the situation is that the entire edifice is basically held together by Linus Torvalds, right? No Linux, everything else falls to pieces. And Torvalds and the teams that Torvalds worked with and trained, and I'm thinking particularly of Alan, I can't remember his second name right now.
Cox.
Short begins. Cox, yes. Yeah. Is also an enormous pillar of that. And, all of the developers and so on. You can't really ever take one of these massively collaborative projects and say, okay, it's just this one guy. But I think that Stallman is in a position where his personal quirks have brought him under increasingly heavy attack. And if we lose the idea that Stallman was one of the pivotal figures in this period of history, not by any means the only pivotal figure, history is not made by individual men, but if we lose access to Stallman as being one of the pivotal figures, what we're going to lose is the idea that this stuff is about human rights rather than about software development methodologies.
Yes.
And I think that we are desperately in need of thinking that is rooted in the human rights discourse. And if we lose sight of the idea that software is a venue for the expression of human rights, it's going to make it enormously harder to think about things like an enduring right to privacy. So I think that it's not so much that Stallman is like the towering Godzilla forefather of this stuff, more that Stallman is a critical thread which is in danger of being cut because times have changed, and frankly, Richard Stallman hasn't, not in a good while.
Right. So I did some analysis on why. So I asked myself the question a few years back: why was it that Stallman had been around for 15 years with the free software movement, and yet it took a bunch of people in a room in Silicon Valley coining the expression open source to make it go big? Why exactly was that? And I think the conclusion I came to was that what has made the phenomenon happen is not so much the user freedom as an accidental byproduct of that, which is that developers who have the freedoms you get from software freedom are able to innovate without having to ask other people's permission first. And that's what's triggered the the massive spread of open source. And that, I think, is why we've come adrift from understanding that it's about rights, because we take it for granted that we have the rights, and we then use the freedom to proceed without permission, taking for granted that we have that freedom. And I think that's the big challenge we face today.
But I mean, the very creation of the terminology open source was the beginning of the motion to disenfranchise Stallman. Right? Open source was not a neutral term. Open source was the idea that we were going to keep the software development methodology and get rid of those awkward guys at the FSF. Right? It was an attempt to take the politics back out of what Stallman had created. And the enormous feuding between Eric Raymond and Richard Stallman about this is one of the critical historical battles that has left us in a world where the users don't have explicit rights. We haven't added new rights to the rights of the user really since Stallman's original 4 freedoms.
Right. So at OSI we never really agreed with that that analysis. There were arguments between some of the people involved in the open source movement, and Eric was one of them, and actually Michael Tiemann was another one. But there were some people who were involved in open source who did not have that agenda. And I would say that talking to Bruce Perrins about this, he is very firm that for him and for many of the other people who are involved, open source was simply a re-expression of the free software movement in terms that didn't automatically lead business people to come to the wrong conclusion. And I think that continuing to perpetuate the view that open source is the ideological enemy doesn't help us solve the current problem, which is that people are using free software or open source software to take away our freedoms. And that's the problem that I think is on the table at the moment.
But to get there, to get to the fix, we have to go back in time to the point where the movement was explicitly depoliticized, right? And it wasn't. Although now it's tempting to say with hindsight that Stallman was, visionary and people should have listened to him. In actual fact, Stallman wasn't visionary. He was mechanically predictive. He wasn't making guesses about what the future was hold. He'd just done the analysis about what the incentives were, and he could tell you exactly where it was going because it was as inevitable as objects falling when you push them off a table. We're in a position where if we don't go back and admit Stallman was right, and actually this depoliticization is part of the reason that we're being strangled by FANG, then it's very hard to go back and explicitly recapitulate and say, okay, we need to go back to a rights-based understanding of what free software is and what the open source movement is. But if we don't admit that an error was made when this stuff was depoliticized, it's going to be incredibly difficult to teach people what it is that Stallman saw, which is that it's all fundamentally about human rights. It's not about developer convenience. Developer convenience is a minor side effect of a human rights framework on technology.
Let me try to move this in a slightly different direction, because I've been, oh my gosh, in my 26 years starting with Linux Journal, there's an argument here that has two sides that will never be answered, will never be solved, but I think that there is not a disagreement about the need to respect rights, and I think the world we live in right now is one where those rights are being completely ignored, whether or not we acknowledge Richard's, role in this thing. I think that's beside a larger point, which is, and it's one you touch on in your book, The Future of Self, which is we need legally guaranteed rights for people that really are not on the books right now. As a matter of fact, in the U.S. at least, there is no right to privacy. There is a founding document by Brandeis and Warren that says that privacy is the right to be let alone. And that found its way sort of indirectly into the GDPR and the right to be forgotten. But it's more a sensibility than an actually articulated right. So I'd like to maybe a way to move forward on this is to take something you said yesterday in a conversation we had, which is that we're trying to fit the modern world into, at least in the U.S., a constitution that's well over 200 years old, 250 years old. as if the founding fathers, and they were only fathers, there were no mothers there. They couldn't imagine a broadcasting, much less a VCR, but much less a digital world where all of us are zero distance apart, with, at no cost. I mean, this is unimaginable. I mean, this is beyond a miracle, beyond loaves and fish. What do you do with that world? And so what you were saying is that, the Constitution should have expanded, should have evolved. And instead it's kind of dragging us down. So where I'd like to go is, what are the rights that aren't guaranteed right now that we need?
So when we start thinking about rights in this kind of format, right, we have to think about how rights become rights. So, the Constitution was a point where a set of rights were recognized, but it's important to remember that some of the framers of the Constitution were very against the Bill of Rights. Most notably, George Mason basically argued that if you write down an enumerated set of rights, those will become the only rights that the people have, rather than saying that the people have an innumerable number of rights and that the government only has a very limited grant of powers. So this is a little bit about the difference between civil law systems and common law systems. So in a common law system, everything is legal unless it's explicitly forbidden. But in a civil law system, like you would get in, for example, France, all the old Napoleonic Code countries, things are forbidden unless they're explicitly allowed. And similarly with the Bill of Rights, once we establish that these are the enumerated rights, the assumption that has been made is that the rights which are not enumerated don't exist. And what's happened is that we've wound up with an ever-shrinking circle of rights without any notion of a fundamental, switch between figure and ground, right? We have rights. It is not our job to enumerate those rights, but the government, when it infringes on those rights, is rapidly, forcibly pushed back inside of its bounds, kind of is the way around that this ought to be, right? And that is certainly the understanding that the framers had of human rights, was that the rights were not just a set of grants from government and everything else wasn't a right. It was that the rights were kind of numinous and fundamental, and you could kind of do whatever you wanted, and any infringement of that freedom was something that the government needed explicit permission for. You see what I mean about it kind of being a figure ground problem?
Yeah, it is a figure ground problem, and I really want to get into figure ground. But before we get into figure ground, which is dear to my heart and mind, let me take a single right, and this is one that's coming up constantly in conversations I'm having right now, in my own work, which is straight from Brandeis and Warren, which is it isn't just the right to be let alone. It's that thank you GDPR and the CCPA and other laws that we have on the books now. We have to opt out of the violation of our privacy with every freaking website that we go to, which is insane. We should have, we have a right to assume, for example, that any vehicle we drive is ours, whether we're leasing it or whatever else, including our browsers, meaning that nobody should have their fingers in our browsers other than who we permit with our own mechanism, whatever that might be. So let's invent the mechanism by which I will, I being a typical user, will grant access to personal spaces and personal data. But otherwise, you've no business in here. And to start there, can you imagine starting there? Or do we need to go past the browser and get to some other way to get around on the net because we're kind of screwed there already?
So, if Mozilla was free from corporate influence, because remember, they're mostly funded by Google, I think that's still true, then, Mozilla would basically ship a version of Firefox which automatically vetoed every request for data that came in on the GDPR stuff. You'd never see the little window where it gives you the 50 million questions for GDPR, because Firefox would just automatically pick that form up, say no to everything, and that'd be the end of the story, right? The fact that we don't see that kind of tool developed, that's happening because all of the browsers are paid for by enormous corporate powers, right? In theory, Apple's agency is with the users because Apple's business model is that it gets paid for selling hardware for the most part. So potentially you'll get this kind of work from Apple, but then Apple has its own strangling tentacle problem. I don't think we're going to solve this until we figure out how to move enormous amounts of, how we move a little bit of money from enormous numbers of users into buckets to pay for software development. I took a crack at this about 10 years ago when I set up some meetings between the folks running a payment platform called Flatter and the Shuttleworth Foundation. And the idea was to build a payment engine into Ubuntu so that at the end of every month, it showed you all the software you'd used, it showed you how many hours you'd used it for, and it gave you the option of making a payment, which would be split among all the teams whose software you were using, proportionate to the time that you'd spent using their software. And I think that it's those kind of payment machineries that are necessary, because if people are not being paid by the users, they're not working for the users. Right. There are some exceptions like Stallman. There are some exceptions like the folks that are working for large companies who happen to produce software which is also of direct benefit to users, like a lot of the infrastructure software, like, I don't know, take your pick, any of the web browsers. Apache would be a good example. But, if you're not paying for it, you're the product, applies universally. So I think we have to figure out how we get people to pay for the creation of a software ecosystem which only serves their interests and not the interests of the corporate funders.
So, it's interesting. We're Simon and I on our own back channel are talking very briefly about whether or not Mozilla is a corporate stooge, and
How could it not be? Where does the money come from?
Well, it's, there is a follow the money side to it, right? There is a follow the money side to it. And I know, but following the money is never a complete explanation. And I think it gets us to places that distract us from one of the other points that you made, we brought up earlier, which is figuring ground, which is we're always, and this is what news primarily is, it's one of my favorite sources, and I may get old on this, is Marshall McLuhan, who says that without radio, we wouldn't have had Hitler or Gandhi, right? That take away radio and those wouldn't have happened. Take away the internet, we probably wouldn't have had Obama or Trump in the U.S. And I'm not saying that those as political statements. They're not. Politics is the figure. The ground is what's underneath it. And the ground is the infrastructure of technology that we have adopted at a given point in history. And cities grew out of railroads. First they grew out of ox carts and things, but then they grew out of railroads. They grew out of shipping, and on seas, and that made port cities powerful and important. Made Venice like one of the world's great powers when it was just a little burg on stilts in the water, but because they were good at shipping, everything else happened. So the internet and digital technology in general is kind of the ground on which the figures of everything else dance. And something we haven't solved yet, I don't think, is how stuff works on that. And this is what your book is about, So what is the ground here on? I mean, right now our stuff that's the Internet of Things is the Internet of Apple and Google and Amazon of things. That's like going back to CompuServe, Prodigy, and the rest of those. And AOL, right, before we had the internet, or before the internet got widely adopted. So what is the ground we're not seeing here?
Okay, so let me pull this into two piles. The first thing is that, the golden age of internet culture, we're talking about Usenet from maybe 88 to 93, 94, the thing that really set the norms before the September that never ended. What we forget is that although there were no corporate regulators that kind of owned that ecosystem, when people misbehaved, their university system administrators would pull their net access. Right. And this is why there was no spam. This is why there was a very limited amount of abuse in things like newsgroups. And what we had was academic privilege, where a certain amount of kind of chicanery and hijinking was acceptable. But if it got to the point where it was causing inconvenience to somebody else's university administration, you would hear about it from your university administration. Right. So we remember this as being a time of freedom, but actually to a very large degree, it was a time where we had sheriffs And it was kind of one sheriff per university department. He was the senior system administrator, almost always he, not always though. And, if you did something wrong, you were going to hear from the sheriff. It was a polite society because the regulation of that society was done by people that were not paid to regulate. They were paid to keep the machine running, and they just did enough regulation so that the machines didn't get shut down by somebody bringing a lawsuit. So I think we have to untangle this myth that the golden age was about freedom. The golden age was about having justice applied by people that we liked, rather than having justice applied by people that were jerks, or that had a corporate interest in heart rather than our interest. And once we kind of accept that, then we're looking at how do we get into a position where we get to pick the people that have power over us, rather than having those people appointed by virtue of the fact that you're going to buy an Apple or you're going to get your email from Google or some other such thing, right? And if we think of this in terms of power and systems of justice, I think you get much better answers than from most of the other possible models of analysis, right? We've got to go right after this question of who is it that stands over us and makes the decisions, and you can't say that on our forum, right? And that sort of analysis, I mean, does that make sense so far? Before I wade into another kind of angle from there?
It's a governance thing, and I think I need. But actually, let's briefly continue with that. And I know Simon has a question after that, but let me go and let the audience know that this episode of Frost Weekly is brought to you by Linode. Managing your complex cloud infrastructure shouldn't be hard. Linode believes in cloud computing for all. They make deploying, managing, and scaling your cloud applications simple. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines and develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Why do over 800,000 developers choose Linode? Well, they give you flat pricing across all 11 global data centers. They have intuitive cloud manager, full-featured API, and they have award-winning customer support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, with no tiers or handoffs regardless of your plan size. So you can think of all the things you can do. Host your website, build your apps, store and backup media. It's all up to you. Easily launch and enrich your developer applications, hosted services, websites, AI and machine learning workloads, gaming services, or CI/CD environments. Launch and scale in the cloud with their virtual machines. Use your $100 credit on S3 compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and more in addition to shared and dedicated compute instances. Be sure to check out Linode's new YouTube channel for video tutorials, security tips, and more at youtube.com/Linode. Bryce Adams from Mattereum says, from the start, we were looking for a partner, not a provider. Some of the large providers see us only as a transaction. Linode is the kind of partner that will be with us from the start today and beyond. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing enterprise infrastructure, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions that allow you to take your project to the next level. Get started with Linode today. Visit linode.com/floss and click on the Create Account button, and you'll get $100 in free credit. To find out more, visit linode.com/floss. That's $100 in free credit when you create your account today. Linode.com/floss or text TWIT to 474747 for a direct link to the offer. Okay, so now that I've done that, I have to remember exactly where we were. So you can, go ahead, because you had a mostly finished thought there, and then I want to get to Simon's topic after that.
So the branch here is, once we kind of frame this as being about governance, then we get into this problem that we have literally no control over the vendors of our physical stuff, right? And that, I think, touches people in a much more tangible, direct way. So, I mean, if I take some, random object, right? Here's a jar of some substance, right? I don't really have much of a legal right to know what's in there, right? There is a list of ingredients on the outside of it, but the regulations around that list of ingredients for what they are forced by law to tell me is enormous. and it doesn't allow for any kind of independent verification. And, there's no sense in which that data is trustworthy. And, it's not just that we need a right to privacy so we can not have people, market us things based on their readings of our psychology and enormous computer models. It's also that the companies have far too much privacy in terms of how they are treating us when we buy things from them. If you buy something and you turn out to be allergic to it, you have essentially no recourse. You can't figure out exactly what chipset is inside of some device you drive. You can't get hold of the software that runs the thing that you've just bought. Oh, I'm very sorry, this microcode is proprietary. Well, okay, but now I don't know what it is that I'm buying. You're just making me some vague promise about what it's going to do. So I got very interested in this because I was trying to build support systems for refugees. I've got a very long-term project on climate, 20 years of work on open source refugee sheltering under the name Hexayurt. We've just got a whole bunch of people living in small bunch of people living in these shelters in LA right now. If you look at lalaunchpad.org, you can see some videos of the folks living in those shelters. And, that gets into this question of how do you do automated provision? How can we know for sure that the systems that we're going to deploy in refugee camps will work, because we've got, deep specifications of what the pieces of equipment are, and then we can figure out automatically what will interlock with what to give us a working system. And once you start thinking about, well, if we had accurate product information, then we could then do automated compatibility, we could do automated allergy screening, we could calculate environmental footprint. And what this begins to look like is if we had transparency about the contents of our physical goods and the manufacturing processes, it gets us action on carbon, it gets us action on modern slavery, it gets us action on human rights abuses in their supply chains of all kinds. It gets us the potential for doing automated management of fleets of property. If I can pick up a phone and be like, do I have a cable that goes to, mini USB-A? I have one of those somewhere? And, it will tell me, yeah, I do. Because, right now, if I want that information, I basically type it into Amazon. And Amazon tells me if I've ever bought that thing. Well, what if I got it from another vendor? So what I began to think about was, what we could do with here is a product information repository that we have, which is ours and is private like our bank account, but it is populated by data that vendors provide for us, with real recourse if the vendors lie to us in that data stream. And, I started building something that does that commercially a couple of years ago. And it wasn't until I was asked to write a book in February about the kind of future of material property that I began to realize that this was the same kind of expansion of human rights that we'd seen with free software. Free software was the right to look inside of your software. And I want a similar right to look inside of my hardware. I want a similar right to look inside of my food, to look inside of my clothing. I want to be able to inspect so that I know that people aren't doing evil on my behalf and then selling it to me as a product. I want to be able to make these decisions for myself rather than having it all be wrapped up in commercial secrecy. And that is what the book is about. It's only a little thing. I mean, it's part of a series of these essays, so it's a wee small read. And I think it's the first thing that I've done in probably 20 years that is actually behind a paywall. It's like it still feels very weird to be like, you have to buy my book. That's a weird concept for me, but you do have to buy it, at least for now. So that was, does that make sense? Do you see what I mean about this kind of human rights driver, right? Like, we need expanding human rights. Stallman is the last big claim of new human rights that I can think of. And I think that there's another one right behind that.
So that's all fascinating there. I have to say that that sounds a lot like a lot of discussions I've heard as I've been following the blockchain movement. That is very much about empowering the individual and maintaining personal information streams. And I know you've been involved a lot in the blockchain movement and in particular in Ethereum. Is there a link here? Do you think that you can only really embrace Ethereum for solutions if you hold a philosophy of individual empowerment?
No. I mean, I think that, the blockchain space is ridden by libertarianism in much the same way that the Green Movement is ridden by communism. Ecology doesn't necessarily require communism, and blockchains don't necessarily require libertarianism. I think that the fundamental truth is that the blockchain is a really good replacement for DNS. It's a fantastic way for managing namespaces. It's a fantastic way for managing the publication of public keys, the revocation of public keys. But it really should be like an anchor, which basically manages namespaces, and then all the transactional stuff should go through systems that look much more like conventional OLTP. The kind of large-scale libertarian promise that is attached to the blockchain, I think, is as unrealistic as the idea that the only way that we can get a sustainable world is by everybody moving back into little villages. I think it's very common that kind of big ideas get attached to a kind of squishy, nebulous, never really delivered set of politics. And I certainly feel that's the way with the libertarian thread in the blockchain. It's never going to happen that way. The governments are not going to let it happen that way. The big companies are not going to let it happen that way. And the individuals, generally speaking, wouldn't like it even if they were offered it. So, I think it's there largely for PR purposes. I don't think that is actually a realistic potential in that set of technology. The world.
I'm very reassured to hear you say that, I have to say.
The world is a really hard place to change, Like, it doesn't matter how impressive your idea is. By the time you stick your idea into the world, if you think of the world as the soup, it doesn't matter what you put into the soup. The soup is largely unchanged. It's an amazingly resilient system.
So I'd like to go into that because the incessant libertarianism that goes with blockchain, or rather mostly with Bitcoin, has led to a recurrent problem, I think, with blockchain technology, where people become fixated on tokens that can be associated with gambling, and they lose sight of the technological capabilities of the idea of a distributed self-referential chain of pointers. And I wonder whether you think that, you've been closely involved in Ethereum. My take on Ethereum is that Ethereum has got quite a lot of that focus on the token and lack of focus on the technology. Do you think that any blockchain technology that has a tradable token can ever succeed?
This is a bit like the problems that we have with VC. VC is historically a problematic industry. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't actually make very good money for the people that invest in VCs. And it has become increasingly a kind of bottleneck on the path to genuine innovation. So in the same way that the kind of Silicon Valley phenomena is kind of ruled by its bankers and they make things unnecessarily difficult in terms of changing the world, similarly the blockchain is to its tokens. All of the same kind of malevolent nonsense that you get from VCs, you get from people that are shilling various kinds of coins. It's massively less regulated, much more predatory. The flip side of that is that it's also paying for a gigantic amount of engineering, which is happening outside of the VC ecosystem and is also happening outside of the big co-ecosystem. So, it's enabling people to build tools that Google would not pay for and keep proprietary, that Facebook would not pay for and then open source this is done with a bunch of their JavaScript stuff. And that VCs would never even dream of funding because it just takes too much money to get anything done. So, what I'm basically saying here is that the machinery required to finance big innovation always comes with an enormous amount of friction and bullshit. And in the blockchain space, you just have different friction and bullshit, but I don't think it's that much worse than what we see in the other domains.
Right. So I've been very encouraged by the blockchain work that Bram Behlendorf has been doing at Linux Foundation, mainly because they focused on the technology and not on the tokens. And so that's part of the motivation behind here. What do you think about Linux Foundation's work? Do you think it's viable, or is it too corporate dominated?
Well, so it's certainly viable for the corporations, in the same way that, say, all the work that went into MySQL and then MariaDB was very viable and important for the corporations. It's also happens to have enormous number of spin-off benefits for individuals. But, if we do the follow the money thing, if 70 or 80 or 90% of the lines of code in project came from people that were paid by their employers to work on that project because the project was used internally, the benefit to the user is incidental, right? And we're still doing very nicely from that incidental benefit, but we always have to ask to whose advantage, right? So the thing that the blockchain token game created, and by the way, I mean, my company has a no tokens policy. If you work for us, you don't trade tokens. We just can't afford the kind of clouded thinking that comes with that game, right? So we take a really pretty extremist stance on that. The problem is that every funding structure comes with its own line of political control. And if we are going to get systems which work directly for the users are going to have to be paying for those systems. And I think that there is some variation on the blockchain token ecosystem which will eventually create entities that have similar problem-solving capability to a large company, but which are entirely paid for by the people who are consuming the services, and they have political representation exclusively, right? So user-owned, user-operated, user-dominated software development, I think, is the only way that we're going to be able to take things like Mozilla and turn out a browser which is super aggressively privacy-oriented and owes nobody anything as a result. Right. And so what I'm basically suggesting is that the long-term evolution of the blockchain is it provides the financial rails required for modeling mass collaboration in a new way, which is much more tightly aligned with the rights of the user's perspective. Because until we are paying for it, we are always going to be the product. And that applies, unfortunately, to everything which is happening in the free software world, except the stuff which is being produced by hobbyists who are sacrificing their own welfare for a long-term political vision. So somewhere here, and I don't think it's today, I don't think it's tomorrow, I think it might take us 5 years, what I would like to see is a system where it's convenient enough for us to pay free software and open source software developers to work directly for us, and we get a kind of collective action model which is almost closer to a labor union that has paid members of staff that work for it than anything that we currently see in either the corporate world or outside of it. You know, I think there is a long-term possibility here, but we're not there yet.
But I mean, is that even viable without universal basic income? Because, you know, it's all very well talking about paying the developers, and we're seeing good initiatives to do that with people like Tidelift, with people like Snowdrift trying to create collectives, with the tendering project that I've been doing at the Document Foundation. But when people aren't being paid, they also need healthcare, and they also need benefits, and they also need sustaining a safety net. And I can't see how an individually paid workforce on tech can possibly work without having UBI for people to fall back on when it's not working.
I mean, the danger here is, again, that if we take the requirement to get free software developers paid and we say that's not going to work until we have basic income, we may have a 30-year wait. We may find that it just never comes in many countries. You know, which is not to say that I'm not in favor of basic income, but, you know, every time that we connect together separate political causes into a kind of coordinated mass, the risk is that the slowest moving agenda then basically shackles the rest of the mass and the thing never goes anywhere. Right. I think that there's a good amount of room for solving relatively narrow problems one after another, while still moving towards, you know, whatever our kind of stated goal is.
Right. But I think that's the reason I'm slightly pushing back on the thought that, you know, we've got to pay the developers to make the software that we want. I think we do pay the developers to make the software that we want. We just pay them via intermediaries called our corporate suppliers at the moment. We've been looking at at LibreOffice, we've had the profound problem that there's no market for desktop productivity software anymore. And so the corporations are pulling out. And how do we make sure the developers still get paid? Paying them directly doesn't seem to be a viable option, but neither does it seem to be a viable option to stop the to disadvantage the corporations. And so I can't see that that there's an easy step towards paying for what you have. And I wonder whether this is the original vision of open source. It was using the attributes of free software to try to get corporate money into making more free software. And I wonder whether that continues to be the way that we should be going, but with the addition of a fierce focus on the rights of citizens who use the software.
I think plugging a payment machine into a major Linux distribution is still by far the best game in town. You know, like, you could do it backed by crypto, you could do it backed by credit card processing. It doesn't matter. What matters is the user interface, where once a month your Ubuntu install or your Linux Mint install or whatever it is comes back and says, hey, you use these programs for 72 hours in the last 31 days. How much would you like to donate to the software developers that worked on all of this stuff for you? And, you've done pretty well this month. You give them $25. Another month you have nothing. You give them nothing. And I think that we could create a conscientious movement where people just habitually donated for the software that they were using. And then you have some kind of administrative issue of figuring out from that pool who gets what, right? But that model, can you convince, free software users, Linux users, that paying a certain amount of money each month to your Linux distribution, who will then fan it out to the modules inside of the distribution, the packages inside of the distribution, I don't think it'd be hard to get people that are ideologically aligned with the free software movement, with Linux as a brand. I don't think it'd be that hard to get people to regularly pay. And, a few dollars a month from a few million people turns into a lot of money really quickly.
So, wow, there's so many directions we can go there, and I believe for a very long time that the, in fact, I even came up with an idea in the Project VRM world called Emancipate, which is that everybody can pay whatever they want for anything, but we have to routinize that in a way that's based on some kind of free and open source code. That makes it easy. I think and we're also moving to a subscription economy right now, where we have no governance system for our subscriptions, and everybody on the supply side is gaming us on a more or less constant basis, when all we want to basically be able to do is say, I want to turn it on and I want to turn it off, and I want simple pricing. And that's and I think, we could go very far with that, but we've basically got about 4 minutes left. So I want to bring up something that kind of showed up on the back channel, which I rarely engage with, but I did this time, which is, and this is a typical geek problem. The geeks will say, I don't want this, or I do want that, and everybody should do what I'm doing. It's sort of like, I'm protecting myself with these 10 things, and I'm perfectly secure, so everybody else should do what that is. And it's kind of like the wizards telling all the muggles they should do what the wizards do, right? And most people are not wizards. But there's also this additional thing, which is a kind of ennui, which is, we are so screwed, so why should we do anything? In particular, it's like we talked about cars over there. We just got a new car in our household, and I haven't read the contract too closely, but basically it says, as I understand it, there's a cell phone in your car that's not yours, it's ours, and it's going to narc on everything that you do for your own good and ours as well. And by the way, we could sell data that we gather from this to the third parties we will not name right now, but trust us, they'll be okay. That's not good enough. I want governance around that. And I'm almost wondering, and maybe this is a question you could answer briefly, is it possible to open source the governance thing in the same way as, we would do a Linux distribution, right? Let's come up with a better way to cough up governance that doesn't start with, how do we protect ourselves from the big evil corporations on the one hand, or how do we help the big evil corporations not suck as much as they do, but within the norms we already have that are completely broken because the inconvenience is maximally, which is, for example, what we get with the opt-out approach that the GDPR more or less instituted.
So the answer is really simple. We unionize, right? If there was a body which was, let's say, 5 million Google users putting $10 a month into a bucket, you would have an entity that had a budget of, literally $50 million a month to police Google on behalf of the users. Lawyers, security analysis, technical analysis, taking apart whatever traffic is going between the browsers and looking for all the tracking stuff that they're inventing, challenging the rights, right? Same thing for Apple. Same thing for Tesla, right? Any large company, if the users of that company are willing to federate and work together, we can set up things which look like labor unions for the 21st world that fight for the rights of the users against encroaching corporate power. And that's largely going to be technical analysis on security and litigation when people are doing things that they shouldn't be doing and get caught. But until we see people that are willing to pay for other people to fight for their freedom, we're going to be left in a situation where there's just nobody to do public interest litigation to push back against corporate power in these critical areas. So I think it all comes down to, if we want to be free, we have to pay people to fight for us, or we have to fight for ourselves. And for most of us, it's way easier to put $10 a month into a fund to go out there and try and manage the corporate powers that are interfering in our lives, than it is for us to entirely disconnect. I can imagine that for most people, it would be way easier to pay your way into a Facebook union and know that you're helping police the platform than it would be to, for example, cut themselves off Facebook and only work on open source platforms. So I think that we need to basically think of this as being a new age of unionization, where we accept that the problem with corporate power is not only our employers, it's also our vendors, and we start figuring out how to reinvent the labor union for an age where we have to police not only the people that pay us, but also the people that we pay.
Wow. Okay. So in our own little back channel, Simon's already brought up that you just described the EFF, and I was thinking that there was an EFF unionette, a little, a union within a union that is only for Apple, only for Facebook, only for Google, only for any of these large platforms. Simon just said an independent Facebook oversight board. I like that. I like that idea, especially if it's got geeks in it who can say things like, "Hey, dudes, you have an algorithm. You have machine learning informing algorithms that inform algorithms that inform algorithms, and you've got this, turtles all the way down way that you have plausible deniability of what you're actually doing." Which is actually what Facebook does. I mean, they've actually said that. We don't know what's going on below the account level, really. We can't look at that. Now, that was several years ago, and maybe they've changed that. But anyway, we're about out of time. So we tend to have 3 additional questions that we ask at the end. Besides, blockchain was one of them. We already covered it. But the first is there anything we haven't asked that you could answer very briefly?
So we didn't talk about the open source housing stuff much. So the Hexayurt, invented in 2002, is a huge open hardware project. Every year they build 5,000 or 10,000 units for Burning Man, half a dozen commercial manufacturers, one of which has a ton of scale, called ShiftPod. So it turns out that you can use open hardware concepts to do basic needs like housing. And, we've got American citizens living in those right now in Los Angeles, LALaunchpad.org. There is strong evidence that we could start building out much more open hardware at this point, because hardware development has gotten easy. CAD tools are amazing. We've got 3D printers that work. So I think it's just worth noting, like open hardware for houses, bicycles, cars, River Simple. There's a decent set of designs for an open source car. Software is largely done. We need to continue to do software. We need to not lose the progress we've made. We've now got a decent shot at going after hardware. Let's start thinking about that. And, wouldn't it be nice if you could get a laptop where you actually had schematics for everything and you could 3D print your own keycaps? That would be lovely. Why don't we do that?
Yeah. Okay, so the last 2, and by the way, I love the Hexayurt in Los Angeles. I was actually thinking you need smaller ones. They're more like the tents that they put up. But anyway, whole other topic. We'll cover it in some other place. Last, but possibly least, your favorite text editor and scripting language.
So about 3 years ago, oh no, longer. Wow, time really flies. So 8 years ago, I made the switch from Python to Go. That's probably the last real tech project I did, was a database encryption system called relational cryptography, prototyping some new ideas about how you manage secure data in SQL databases. Did the entire thing as a full stack web project with Go as all the backend stuff, and I loved it. So definitely Go. And for anything that involves doing code, Emacs, of course, And for everything else, Apple Pages, really, really nice to use for getting text on a page quickly, and Google Docs for anything that involves collaboration, because not everybody that I work with uses Apples. And all of those systems still leave me nostalgic for Borland Sprint, which was a word processor from the 1980s, which was the best damn text creation environment ever. And I wish that somebody would release the source code for that thing, because it was astonishingly good.
Well, that's fantastic. And thank you so much. We have an infinite amount of things to talk about, and we're more than out of time. So thanks again, Vinay, and we'll see you on the interwebs.
Splendid. Really fun talking, guys. And I will continue to fight the good fight and be the zealot that everybody really needs, but
that we
nobody actually wants.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. Wonderful. So thanks a lot. So Simon, whole lot of stuff going on with this one.
Yes, I don't even know where the end of the string is, let alone how to pull it.
I know. It's there's so much there, and I don't even know, and maybe Simon can jump in and tell us where his book is available. I mean, I had a copy of it on PDF, and I hope that people read it. It's a short book, and it's really a very long essay that I highly recommend, because it's got some great thoughts in it. I sent some of that to you by email, but too late, I think.
Yes, I did. I actually got, you sent me the PDF of the book. I'm not sure that it's easily available just yet, because it's part of a series, and I think it's just coming out around about now.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that goes in the show notes. We'll get that from Vinay and put that in the show notes. I think the interesting thing in looking at that is working out at what level you have to look for root causes so that you can find solutions. So and that's where my disagreement about whether the figurehead is Stallman comes from here. I think that the exploitation that has happened with ad tech, which has created the society we've got here, would have arisen regardless of whether we had focused on end user rights, because I think it's the product of the neoliberal philosophy and the economic culture that it's created. And I think it's unexpectedly been like yeast eating sugar, living on the Stallmanite philosophy of individual freedom and the Bill Joy's philosophy of individual lassitude, which are the co-roots of the free and open source software movement. And the whole program has been kind of rotating around that stuff. And I'm not quite sure where the thematic core is. So it will be exciting to see what title you come up with for it, Doc.
Yeah. Well, I still like The Future of Stuff for this one, just because it's the title of his book. But but arguing about Stallman versus Raymond and others is a little bit arguing about, when did the Age of Enlightenment start? Did it start with Descartes or Bacon or Rousseau or about the Protestant Reformation? I mean, was that Luther, or was it, Calvin, or it was a big thing, and it's, or the Renaissance. I really do think we're going to look back 100, 200 years from now on this era that we're still in right now. This is the beginning of something. It's not I mean, I doubt any of the figures you talked about earlier, starting with RMS and you included, you and me and Vinay too at this point, are all parts of this thing. All the Floss listeners are parts of this too. We're involved in a lot of fights among ourselves, but I think there are some deeper and larger fights that are the ground that Vinay talks about, and not the figures on it. Yeah, and we still fully understand what the ground is.
It's been a year of learning this year. We've learned
huge.
that any system that's anchored on the decency of individuals is going to fail. We have learned over the last 4 years in America, And
any system that's anchored on the decency of individuals is going to fail. I actually thought you were going to go the other way with that.
No, that
wow.
I think the big governance lesson that America has taught the whole world is that if your system of governance is ultimately anchored on the decency of individuals, you're at risk.
I think it goes back to that decency, but we are out of time and we need to go into post-production. So we need to have, I don't know, a big panel on this at some point. This has been a great show. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Twit folks, for thank you, Back Channel, and everybody who works on cars. This has been Floss Weekly. We'll see you again next week.
Want more Twit? Well, check out Smart Tech Today. It's at twit.tv/STT. It's the show where Matthew Casanelli and I cover everything there is to know about smart tech. It's automation, it's connected devices, it's smart home, it's all those goodies and so much more. We get the news, we get the latest devices, we do reviews, everything. You gotta check it out, twit.tv/STT for Smart Tech Today.